Can you state your name and your profession?
My name is Bui Diem. In Vietnamese we say Bui Diem. I was for a time between 1966 and 72 ambassador of South Vietnam to the US. And later on, when I got back to Vietnam after 72, I served as ambassador at large for Vietnam, mostly with the responsibility of going around the world and promoting the cause of Vietnam.
Wonderful. Sir, this is our second interview with you for documentary film Journey to Freedom of Vietnamese American, and we would like for you to help us to shine on some of the historical event, especially the mission of or the effort of lobbying for the aid to South Vietnam to fight the last days in the war. Can you recall that right after the peace agreement, Paris peace agreement signed, where were you and what you were doing at that time? Can you recall?
Well, if we can talk about the beginning of the withdrawal of the West from Vietnam, we should start by the signing of the Paris Agreement in January 73. And all of us, we know that with the signing of this Paris Agreement in January 73, the US withdrew its troops from Vietnam and continued to aid South Vietnam to defend itself against the communists. But after the signing of the Paris Agreement in January 73, President Thieu was invited by President Nixon to visit the US. And so that is the reason why we had the meeting between President Nixon and President Thieu at San Clemente in April 1973. I had been asked by President Thieu during the preparation of the Paris Agreement to try to convince the American negotiator that, the North Vietnamese troops should be withdrawn from South Vietnam, but we didn't succeed, and the Paris Agreement continued to disregard this problem of the presence of the North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. But somehow the Paris Agreement was signed, and in April 73, President Thieu had the opportunity to come to the US and had meeting with President Thieu in San Clemente. During the meeting of San Clemente, of course, President Thieu sought to have the continuation of the US aid to Vietnam, and both in military terms and in economic terms. In military terms, it had been, of course, the concern of the South Vietnamese about the continuation of the communists from North Vietnam to continue their war against South Vietnam. And as far as this problem is concerned, that President Thieu did receive some kind of assurances from President Nixon that if it happened that the North Vietnamese committed some kind of violation of the Paris Agreement, the US would react to help South Vietnam. That is the kind of promise that President Nixon gave to President Thieu at San Clemente. In terms of economic aid, President Nixon said that, well, the US would continue to aid South Vietnam, but in the same time asked President Thieu to go to Washington to lobby some of the US senators for the continuation of this economic aid. And that is exactly what President Thieu, after San Clemente, came to Washington and talked to a lot of congressmen and senators for the continuation of economic aid to South Vietnam. But you know that sometime around April and May 1973 in the US there was a very, very special development, and that we call later on the Watergate. And with the Watergate, we saw it right away that it was very difficult for President Nixon to keep his promise. He was almost absorbed by defending himself in the Watergate problem. But somehow, if we continue 73, at the end of 1973, we have seen that the US Congress voted a resolution to the effect that the US troops in Southeast Asia should not continue to operate the way it had been done before. And so we saw that in military terms as well as economic terms, there was a de-escalation of the US aid to South Vietnam. And so the problem continued after 73, and in 74 the situation in South Vietnam, we have seen that the communists, they continue their aggression without having the US reacted in one way or another. You remember that in 74 there was the Battle of Bình Long, a big battle in which the communist North Vietnam committed a lot of their regular divisions against South Vietnam, but there was not a single sign of reaction from the US the way it had been promised by President Nixon to President Thieu at that time of the San Clemente meeting.
So, IBD from published by many others, they mentioned about President Thieu would hesitate or have many points against the peace, the Paris Agreement, and was promised by President Nixon at the time, said decided, and once again he promised that he will have U.S. troops intervenes if there attack or violation from the north. So the promise would have been made before the Paris Agreement. Was it true, sir? Can you elaborate that?
Well, it was clear in 73 that the political tension in Washington after the signing of the Paris Agreement, the political tension was somewhat down. But the atmosphere in the US at this period of time was completely on the internal problem of the US, and as I have mentioned before, on how President Nixon defended himself in the Watergate mess. And so the US didn't think much in terms of how to help South Vietnam during this period of time. I came to prepare for President Thieu visit in San Clemente, and sometime in March, before the San Clemente meeting, the atmosphere was completely relaxed about Vietnam. People in the US thought it in terms of internal problem more than international problem, the way it had been before. And that is the reason why, to a large degree, the problem of Vietnam was somewhat out of mind of the US. They said that they got out already, and so they have to concentrate their attention to all the problem, internet problem as well as the problem in the Middle East, for instance, you see. And so we saw right away that there was a continuation of the degradation of the US interest in the problem of Vietnam.
So I would like to understand once again about the promise that the U.S. had to President Thieu visit South Vietnam, even would lead to President Thieu before the Paris Agreement signed. And my next question will be, although promise could verbally promise. Can you
that is quite an interesting point, because these promises were only the kind of verbal promises, you see, not the kind of written promise the way it had been done in South Korea, for instance, or in Japan. There was a formal agreement between South Korea and the US, and between Japan and the US, to the effect that if there are problems with South Korea being attacked by North Korea, well, the US had the duty to intervene, you see, but not in the case of Vietnam. And that is a very interesting point that the Vietnamese have to remember in the future. If there is something to be done, it should be done in writing and approved by the US Congress, instead of, well, just a kind of verbal promise from the president. President can be one day for one policy, but suppose that there is another president coming in, and the new president cannot is not obliged to continue the same policy advocated by the previous president, you see. In case of South Korea or in case of Japan, for instance, there are written agreement, and then all the president coming after the agreement signed before, well, they have to follow the same pattern, you see. And that is a very important point for the Vietnamese in the future, that if there is something with another big power on some problem, it is better to be on writing and approved by the US Congress than the kind of simple verbal promise from a president or from a Secretary of State like Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, he quite often said to me that you can count on us, you see. How we can count on him with this kind of verbal promise like that.
So I believe that President Thieu was asked to visit U.S. Before the Paris Agreement signed. Was it true?
Yes, I had been in touch with Mr. Hoàng Đức Nhã, but then the private secretary of President Thieu, and many times already I have communication with him about this problem that we call it the fishing expedition, which was a kind of code name between himself and myself. Well, through the fishing expedition, we tried to convince the American government that they should invite President Thieu to visit Washington. But somehow, for one reason or another, and with one motive or another, the US declined this kind of suggestion from our part. And President Thieu was lucky to have an opportunity to visit the US at San Clemente when the Paris Agreement was signed already.
Yes, people think that a president the present from U.S. Give to President Thieu for what he he did U.S. request by signing the Paris Agreement. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I think that to a certain degree it was quite clear that just before the Paris Agreement being signed, there were talks between myself and General Hackett and Henry Kissinger, for instance. You see, it was implied that well, go ahead and sign the Paris Agreement, and after that it would be a kind of invitation to President Thieu to visit San Clemente. As far as this part of the promise, they keep it and they invited Thieu to San Clemente, you see, in April. But from my very personal point of view, I think that, well, a big power like the US behaved not a very elegant way with the South Vietnamese, because well, on the side of the communist world, we heard that in Moscow sometimes they called the South Vietnamese the bastards. But when North Vietnamese visited Moscow, it was always a red carpet, you see. So it was a very, very sensitive problem between the US and Vietnam during the whole war in Vietnam. President Thieu never succeeded in coming to the US itself, because the last visit on the US soil before San Clemente was Honolulu. I came to Honolulu with President Thieu. Well, that was the only visit of President Thieu had made it to the US at that time.
So you would mention that South Basta, who called him and in what occasion, do you remember?
Oh, well, it was been reported in many press reports, international press report, rumors and quotations and a lot of things like that. Sorry, it had been mentioned many times already that those Russians, they were not always happy about the North Vietnamese, and I would presume that the same attitude from the Chinese was not far different from the attitude that those people in Moscow have in regards to the North Vietnamese.
I see, and they calling North Vietnamese as bastards?
Well, as I have said before, I heard a lot among the diplomatic circle that the Russians had a very bad idea of the North Vietnamese, but well, they receive it, you see, the North Vietnamese.
So now we're back to San Clemente meeting. You recall what is the content, really the core of that meeting was?
Well, the core of the meeting, as I have just mentioned to you before, it was in two parts. In the military part, it was promised that if there was a violation of the Paris Agreement, the US would intervene violently, you see, retaliated against North Vietnam. And in terms of economic aid, the US promised to continue to aid South Vietnam, in spite of the fact that by 1973 and by 1974 it was down already, you see, not at the level we had before. And through some kind of manipulations inside the budget of the defense, you see, some of the part of the aid was switched from the economic aid to the side of the military part of the defense department. And so consequently the aid, economic aid and military aid to South Vietnam was substantially reduced, even before 1974 and 1975. And when in 75, when I came to lobby for an emergency aid in April 75, well, it was the final act from the U.S. to cut more, to cut aid to South Vietnam. You know very well that I came to the U.S. in April 75, in March 75, yes, to lobby for what we call an emergency aid of 700 million to South Vietnam.
So you just talk about the reduction of the aid from the U.S. to South Vietnam. Can you recall when and what was the maximum that we got from U.S. and then from there it started reducing to 700 million, and you have to make a trip to try to secure that, but didn't have success. So can you recall what
I don't have the figures about the U.S. added in to South Vietnam, but at that period of time, but I remember vividly that military aid and economic aid to South Vietnam in 74 and 73 was almost reduced to a mere around 300 or 400 millions.
Very good. From what number? What figure? The highest?
From at least 700 million before, you see. And well, we have to double check about these figures, but I remember that it was sometime between 700 million before, and it was reduced later on. And please remember that with the war in Israel and the oil crisis at that time, the cost of oil was very much very high, and most of the aid was consumed by this kind of high cost that we had to pay for many part of the U.S. to South Vietnam.
So in the trip that President made in 1973, did he see anybody in Congress? I mean, House and Senate?
Oh yes, when we had been in San Clemente, President Nixon had some kind of advisors to President Thieu about how to lobby the U.S. Congress for the continuation of U.S. to South Vietnam. And consequently, after San Clemente, President Thieu came to Washington, and from advisors of President Nixon, he visited a lot of senators on the budget committee, Senators Stanley, for instance, and some of the senators, in view of explaining to them the need of South Vietnam for the continuation of aid to South Vietnam. And in fact, that Mr. Thieu did visited a lot of U.S. senators and congressmen. I went along with him at that time.
How was it, the atmosphere when those meetings went?
Well, the atmosphere was quite correct at that time, because as I have mentioned before, there was no more political tension. that we had during the war. So the conversation was okay, all right, but they advised us to continue to lobby for US aid in contacting a lot of congressmen and other senators, and that is exactly what we did later on, without much success, I have to confess. But we continue a lot after this San Clemente meeting to visit the US congressmen or visit the US senators for US aid to Vietnam. But unfortunately, we didn't succeed much.
That you value like a diplomatic but not much action. I mean,
there is no possibility of more action than what we did at that time, because we have to remember that in South Vietnam after 73 we have a lot of problems in terms of how to face the continuation of attacks from North Vietnam.
My question was those reaction from senator and congressman, they very much like diplomatically meet delegation from Vietnam, but
yeah,
that's what I meant by it.
Yes, and we invited a lot of US congressmen and senators to visit South Vietnam by that time, but you remember that there are a lot of congressmen from the US who are very much on the left side of the political spectrum. And the lady, if I remember well, Abdul Aziz, the lady who was the head who came to Vietnam and who...
Yes, you're talking about the actress Jane Fonda?
Yeah. But anyway, the interest of the US in South Vietnam was not at the level it should be for Vietnam to defend itself. And the continuation of the attacks from those people who sympathize with North Vietnam continue. And that is the reason why it was difficult for the US congressmen who were on our side to continue to vote for the same amount of budget that they had given before to South Vietnam.
Wonderful. So from visit by President Thieu until 1975 that you have the mission from President Thieu came to US to try to for I call it the impossible mission for fighting aid for Vietnam. Since that period of time from 73 to 75, what was can you describe what the effort of
briefly speaking, the situation in South Vietnam deteriorated beginning by 74. The economy of South Vietnam by then was in bad shape. The civilian government employees and the families of the soldiers, they were in very bad shape in terms of economic situation. Adding to that, the situation in Vietnam in political terms was serious too, because there was opposition to President Thieu. That is the reason why when after the attack from the communist side in the area of Bình Long, where the communist side committed a lot of regular divisions, their own regular divisions. we had serious problem both in economic terms and in military terms. This situation continued at the end of 74 and the beginning of 75. And as I have mentioned before, there was not a single reaction from the US society in terms of how to react to the communist attack, because it had been clearly demonstrated to everyone that the communists violated the terms of the Paris Agreement. To a certain degree, this kind of attitude from the US encouraged the North Vietnamese to continue their attacks against South Vietnam, especially when they received a massive aid from the Soviet Union and the Chinese. So the situation in South Vietnam deteriorated in both economic terms and in military terms up until the beginning of 75. And on March 75, if I remember well the date, the communist side attacked the South Vietnamese in the city of Ban My Thuột. And the South Vietnamese lost the city of Ban My Thuột on the 10th of March 1975.
Yeah, I would like to ask you a question right there. That many people later on, I interviewed, South Vietnamese officer and other politicians. They think that President Thieu intentionally abandoned Ban My Thuột to get attention from US. How is your comment on that?
Well, that is a very special aspect of the problem. I tried myself to ask President Thieu about his decision to withdraw from Pleiku and Kon in 1975 after the loss of Ban My Thuột. To be very candid with you, I never succeeded in having a clear-cut answer to this problem because Mr. Thieu refused to see me for one reason or another after 75, and I had never the opportunity to ask him the very specific questions about how he made the decision to withdraw from Pleiku and Kon. But anyway, after the loss of Ban My Thuột in March 1975, Mr. Thieu asked me to come to see him. I remember very well. He asked me to go to the US to lobby for an emergency aid of 700 million. I remember well. He talked in terms of a Vietnamese saying, as long as there is still water, we have to scrub it. Còn nước còn tắt. He said to me that, well, you have to go over there and you have to lobby for this kind of very special aid of 700 million that we call emergency aid. But before going to Washington, please.
Can you continue?
Yes, and during the meeting of President Thieu, he said to me that, well, you go to see President General Cao Van Vien who can describe to you the military situation. So I went to see Cao Van Vien after, sometime around the 17th or 16th of March 1975. Well, I saw a big map on the wall, and General Cao Van Vien described to me the military situation by then. I took the plane that immediately after seeing General Vien, but as soon as I arrived in Paris, the whole thing collapsed. You see, it means that the withdrawal from Pleiku and Kontum was a military collapse because the communist troops ambushed the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese troops on Route 7, if I remember well. And it was a very, very important defeat for the South Vietnamese because the operation of withdrawal from Pleiku and Kontum was not well planned, and that was the main reason why we suffer a lot of losses during this period of withdrawing the troops from Pleiku, Kontum down to Nha Trang. And by then the situation became extremely dangerous because at that time the North Vietnamese attacked the northern part of South Vietnam in Da Nang, and Da Nang fall in the same time. I remember well that I was in Washington at that time, seeing the whole thing collapse on TV and trying to get in touch with the American side and to try to understand the situation. I understood then that President Thieu had the intention to send General Nguyen and Shackley to go to South Vietnam for an on-the-spot survey of the situation. The situation in South Vietnam in military terms continued to deteriorate with the loss of Da Nang, and the North Vietnamese troops continued their march down to Nha Trang and Phan Rang. General Nguyen visited South Vietnam along with Shackley, and when they returned after a week in South Vietnam, I came to see General Nguyen and Shackley. Separately, I saw Nguyen and he said to me that the situation is critical, but not in terms of completely lost. And he said that if we can have a supply for the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese troops, and perhaps we can stand it for a period of time. So according to General Nguyen, it was not completely hopeless. There are still some hopes. But when I saw Shackley at that time, Shackley had a very, very bad impression.
Shackley tên nó đánh bần sao không?
S-H-A-C-K-L-E-Y, Shackley. Hình như thế thì tôi double check ở trong cuốn sách của tôi chút nữa. Hắn là CIA nhưng mà Director of the Asian sector.
Bác nói lại cho con là ông Shackley là ai? Nhưng mời bác bắt đầu lại.
I talked to General Nguyen and have just mentioned that, well, according to General Nguyen, the situation was extremely difficult but was not that hopeless. I tried to see Shackley, the director of the Asian division of the CIA. Shackley was very, very pessimistic. He described President Thieu at that time as somewhat disoriented, you see, not seeing the situation in a clear way. And so I was very, 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 very disappointed myself after seeing Nguyen and Shackley. And in the same time, just for a few more days, I continued to try to lobby for the emergency aid of 700 million. But somehow it was hopeless, exactly the way many of my friends described, because when I come to see Congressman some of the friends who defend me before, who defended South Vietnam before, they tried to avoid me. So I saw clearly the sign of the U.S. decision to give up helping South Vietnam already. And in just a matter of few days, it was a clear-cut decision from the U.S. Congress. They vote no to the demand of the South Vietnamese and the U.S. administration. I have to confess that the Ford administration continued to do its best, but without any much success itself, you see. And so the U.S. Congress voted no to the demand from the U.S. administration for the 700 million to South Vietnam. And by the time that I took the decision that there is no more things to do in Washington, and I took the plane to come back to Vietnam around the middle of April 75.
So this is a personal question. Here you are in US and try your best, meet many people if they were willing to meet you, and do anything you can to try to have people, swing people mind that can come back and help South Vietnam in a critical time. And on TV every night you come home and you see the collapsing of the country. People die on route number 7 and so forth and so on, and you draw in the conclusion that, well, nothing more to do, they really abandon us now. What's your feeling like? Can you
I returned to Vietnam in the middle of April, just 1 week before the final collapse. I have noticed that there was a kind of, I had the feeling that the South Vietnamese, even at that time, still had a lot of illusions about the U.S. When I met with Vietnamese military men, they talked about rumors that, well, the B-52 can come back and wipe it out the convoy from North Vietnamese. They talk in terms of Kissinger trying to talk to Moscow in view of having a political situation to save South Vietnam. As far as myself was concerned, I saw it clearly that, well, that is the end of the U.S. intervention in Vietnam. And when I saw the Prime Minister Nguyen Ba Can, when they asked me about the U.S., I said that, well, my opinion is quite clear. The U.S. has abandoned South Vietnam already. There is no way for the U.S. to come to help South Vietnam. It is up to us right now to try to get out of the situation the best way possible. But in terms of relying on the U.S., there is no more possibility of relying on the U.S. at that time. So it was a kind of big disappointment from my friends, both in the government and in the military, when I told them the truth the way I saw it in 1975, in April 75, when I returned to Saigon in the mid of April. And as I have mentioned to many friends already, I had almost daily contacted with Ambassador Graham Martin. As soon as I get back to Vietnam, he called me on the phone and said to come to see me right away. When I saw him, he asked me the first question, did you see Thieu? I said, no, not that yet, because Mr. Thieu, well, would like me to see the Prime Minister, you see. So I didn't have the opportunity to see President Thieu. But the next day, Graham Martin called me again, you see. He said, did you see Thieu? I said, not yet. And so he said to me that, well, perhaps I have to take the decision myself and to try to see him right away. He came to see Thieu on Monday. The 20th, it seemed to me, and the 21st, Thieu, in a public TV session, resigned from his, from the presidency of South Vietnam.
So do you think that Ambassador Martin has something to do with that?
Well, I think that I don't know exactly what Martin said to Thieu at that time, but I remember that in the few days before that, when he talked to me, he said to me that, well, you have to tell Thieu the truth. And I said to Thieu, what truth do you want me to tell him? My truth is that the US has given up South Vietnam already. You want me to talk to him in that terms? He didn't respond to me at all, but on Sunday he came to see Thieu, and obviously he had some kind of conversation with Thieu, which convinced Thieu that there is no way for him to continue to be president and that he have to give up. And exactly what he did on April the 21st. I stayed for us in Saigon in few more days, and I asked Martin the way he promised me before, and if you need my help to get you out. I called him that there is no place for me right now in Saigon, so I have to get out. And the next day he asked for a private plane from Bangkok, a small Navy plane from Bangkok, and I flew out from Saigon in this plane that provided to me by Martin.
What day was it, sir?
Well, it was Monday the 21st was the day Thieu resigned at 22, 23, 24, 26, 27, something like that. I flew out just a few days before, 2 or 3 days. When I arrived to New York, the communists bombarded the airport of Tan Son Nhut already, and so the plane from Panam was the last to get out of Saigon on that day.
So did you Thieu trip when who arranged for him to leave Vietnam after he resigned? You know anything about that?
No, I know nothing about it, but American side that on Monday he resigned, and on Thursday he left Vietnam for Taiwan.
I see.
And of course I didn't see him from the time that I came back. I didn't see him at all.
You didn't share the feeling that I asked earlier about when you know that there nothing left for South Vietnam, and with all your effort, you did everything and it didn't come to any result, and you.
Oh well, at that time during these hectic days in Saigon, there was a lot of rumors from all sides. You see, rumors from. Those people who wish for the US to come back, the way I mentioned, they said that the B-52 would come back and wipe out the US, the North Vietnamese troops. And there was rumors about the neutralist government with the machination of the French ambassador Marion by that time. And there was rumors about Moscow trying to intervene in Moscow for a kind of division of South Vietnam down the 17th parallel, but not on the 17th, but down after perhaps including Hue, for instance. So a lot of rumors, you see, incredible rumors, you see. But as far as I am personally concerned, that I was totally convinced at that time that the US had given up on South Vietnam already, and that there is no more room for doing anything at that time, and that is place for no one in South Vietnam if they wanted to think in terms of having a free South Vietnam at that time.
What's your feeling like at that time when you know that?
Well, a very sad feeling. I was sad at that time. I was sick at the same time, and my wife, I called her on the phone, and we had a kind of tacit understanding between us when I say that I'm going to attend the wedding of a friend. It means that I am going to leave. So my wife asked me, well, you have to go right away, you see. And so I left Saigon on sometime June 24th or 25th, just a few days before the final collapse.
I also heard that there was a effort of getting a loan from somewhere to support the troops, who are running out of bullets and gas and everything else. Can you elaborate about that?
Well, briefly speaking, I have to mention right away that when I talked to the military man, when I returned to Saigon after Washington in April 75, I learned, well, I did learn before, but it was in a very, very stark terms when I returned that the South Vietnamese practically have no possibility of fighting the war at all because, well, there is shortage of ammunition, there is shortage of fuel. The planes could not take off to helm the South Vietnamese troop, for instance, you see, and the artillery group, for instance, they have a ration of 2 or 3 rations of bullet and in the morning, and as soon as they finish it, that is the end of it, you see. So in practical terms, while the North Vietnamese were massively helped by tanks and by a lot of heavy arms and ammunition, you see, the South Vietnamese lacked almost everything. So no more aid from the US, but in the same time, in terms of military situation in South Vietnamese troops, they have no more ability to fight the war, and they have to accept this very bad situation of having to defend it with practically almost without ammunition. And I point out one thing. Very often the international press, when they criticize the South Vietnamese, they say that the South Vietnamese did not fight at all. It is completely untrue, because when we talk about defeated and about surrender, we never saw before general from a foreign army to kill themselves because they didn't want to surrender to the North Vietnamese. Talking about the French defeated in 1940. in 1940. The French defeated by the German enacted. We never listen about the French general committing suicide just for not surrendering to the German. And yet the South Vietnamese general, they did commit suicide because they didn't want to surrender. It is incredible, but well, that is the truth, and we have to mention it for generations in the future to understand that the South Vietnamese did fight, but in a in extremely difficult condition, and they committed suicide just for the honor of South Vietnam.
So talking about international press, during the time your mission fighting it for to rescue South Vietnam, did you get a chance to meet any press, and if so?
Oh well, I had a very frequent. I had very many frequent contacts with the international press during my career. I was a press man myself, so I was in a very familiar terms with them, with all of them. And I have noticed that exactly the way it is right now in the US. The press, in general terms, it was and still is on the leftist side, you see. Most of the time, they have very liberal ideas about freedom and about corruption in the government here and there and so forth, you see. So in general terms, the international press was in favor, without knowing it, that they worked for the cause of the other side, you see. In 1968, for instance, when I came to Paris to observe the negotiations in Paris between Henry Kissinger and the other side, you see, there was protests from the students in Paris. It was like almost a revolution in Paris in 1968. Demonstration from students in Paris, demonstration of students in Germany and in almost everywhere, you see. And the international press was in favor of a kind of revolution, as if, the population was against the government in power at that time, you see. So it is no surprise to me at all when we talk about the so-called sympathy that the international press had for the communist side. You remember in Paris, Jean Lacouture and a lot of French journalists, they wrote a lot of things about Ho Chi Minh and about other people, and only after the war, after they visited Vietnam after the war, did they recognize that they were wrong in defending the cause of North Vietnam, because they didn't know much about North Vietnam at that time. And they know North Vietnam only after the end of the war. But well, that is an aspect of the international problems around the world, you see, and we have to confront this problem the way it had been and the way it is in many cases.
So I asked you, do you see you talking about press criticize South Vietnam, and many of them said that the war. We lost the war because of corruption from government of South Vietnam. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I used to say to my friends that I laugh about it because corruption is everywhere. Even in the US they have corruption. It is only a matter of degree. I remember that in South Vietnam at that time, perhaps the most corrupted of the general, the maximum that they get is perhaps, not up to $1 million, for instance. That is the most important case, for instance. But right now, the North Vietnamese, they got hundreds and millions and billions in dollars, you see. So it is a matter of degree. Talking about Afghanistan and talking about Iraq, you see. Everywhere there is war, there is some kind of corruption. And the international press talked about corruption as if it was the only cause of the defeat of those people. That is completely wrong. Well, corruption we have. I used to say that South Vietnam at that time, of course, was not a paradise, but at the same time, it was not hell either. So, in the beginning of the establishment of democracy, we have to suffer a period of transition from one authoritarian regime to a freer regime in terms of toward democracy. We have all these problems in a human society, you see. So it is normal. It is unfair for the international press to put all these problems on the shoulders of the South Vietnamese by them. Take an example. The international press and the US press used to say that the Americans spent billions of dollars in South Vietnam. But how much the billions were spent in South Vietnam? The billions of US dollars spent by the US Army was on bombing and on, well, hot meals that the helicopters had to bring to the fighting troops, U.S. fighting troops in Vietnam. That is the kind of billions of dollars U.S. spent by the U.S. Army. I have to say that I am not an anti-American at all, not at all. But I have to point out the reality the way it is. And it is up to the Vietnamese to understand that in spite of its immense power as a kind of superpower, the Americans have a lot of influence around the world. And if we can secure the American aid, we should. But in the same time, we have to understand that there is a lot on the American side, and we have to understand the American system and understand in the same time the limits of the US power, because there are a lot of limits, and we have to understand it.
I may go a little further by asking you that I see a lot of people criticize South Vietnam society, government, and everything, and have very little anyone describe about North Vietnam, how the life like. And I interviewed some people who live in North Vietnam during that time, like writer Dương Thu Hương, and she described her life and the rest of the population their life in one very strong sentence. She said that we live like animals. So that kind of life that South Vietnamese or any Vietnamese don't want to live, or anybody in the world don't want to live in. So can you explain why is that in the world that people ignore, the conditions?
Well, it is very easy to try to explain it, because you agree with me that the North Vietnamese for dozens and dozens of years they live in a very, very totally controlled society, and they know nothing about the outside world. You talk about Dương Thu Hương, for instance. Dương Thu Hương was very much in favor of the other side, and she participated in many of the operations when she had been in the north. And when she came to South Vietnam, she almost cried, because she saw the kind of very relaxed atmosphere that we had in South Vietnam at that time, you see. So it is quite understandable. In every communist regime, the population is under total control by the regime, and they know almost absolutely nothing about the outside world. Talking about the North Korean, for instance, they know nothing about the outside world. And talking about the North Vietnamese, in 1975. I have many members of my family coming from North Vietnam. When they came to South Saigon, they brought some bowls of rice and sugar, and they said that, well, they thought that in South Vietnam we lack everything and that we are slave of the Americans, you see, and they opened their eyes, but it was too late. And so that is the situation right now. Fortunately, there is the internet, and people now begin to understand more than the way it had been done before. And perhaps one of these days, you see, the whole population would understand it, would come up, and by then it would be the end of the communist regime. But it takes time. I used to say to my young friends that when I go around the country to talk to the students, I said that, well, they are lucky to have the opportunity to be in the US and to learn how much it means to be in a democratic country like the US. But in the same time, talking about Vietnam, they have to be patient because the communists are still over there. Obviously, there was a lot of change already, you see. We have seen that from the 80, for instance, the end of 80 and to the situation right now, there are a lot of change. But it still takes a little bit of more time for the population to understand completely how much it is difficult to live in under the communist regime. And so perhaps later on, well, in the next future, sooner than later, I hope the people of South Vietnam and the people of North Vietnam would wake up and would see a more freer, more democratic, respecting human rights for the people with dignity.
So,
yes, you ask again about.
who Ho Chi Minh was?
Well, there are a lot of books and literature about Ho Chi Minh. Most of the liberal press gives the impression all the thought that Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, trying to save Vietnam from French colonialism. Well, my personal opinion is quite clear. If I can give him some benefits of the doubt, I would say that, well, there are few percentage in his mind for Vietnam. But most of the times when he worked for the third international communism, even when he was young, his mind was most of the time on the communist side more than a nationalist side. I remember well, he said that before his death that if I have to join later on in the next war, I would like to join Marx and so forth, you see. So, well, his mind is more on the communist side than more on the nationalist side.
So, I mean, the press, in the textbook, film, also the media, when they describe Lenin, Stalin, Mao in China, they all call them brutal dictator, and they describe them very clearly that those bad leaders kill their own people, so on and so on. But Ho Chi Minh, they have a very different, description that he, the father of the country who brought independence, happiness to Vietnamese people, and of course we don't see that. How is that happens?
Well, that is what I call it in the 60s, a kind of wave in the international world, a wave in favor of communism. I take the concrete example of the French intellectual that I used to call the intellectual of the left side of the Seine, les intellectuels de la rive gauche. You see Jean-Paul Sartre, we see Jean Lacouture. Jean Lacouture wrote in the book about Ho Chi Minh, but later on he visited South Vietnam and later he returned and he wrote another book completely different from the previous book. André Gide, the famous writer from the French, he was very much in favor of Lenin and Stalin and so forth. But when he visited Moscow and he returned, he wrote a book, Retour de Luxe. It means that after the visit to the Soviet Union. So it means that there was a time when the communist wave was much on the high time, you see. And when the communist wave was on a high time, and almost the intellectuals around the world, almost the international press was in favor of the communists. It is only now that they begin to understand what does it mean to be communist and to have to live under communism.
Thank you for have that clear message. This is I want to ask you also. Here a lot of books, material or film. They call us South Vietnam, and you present South Vietnam in the United States. They call us they call you. American puppets. What do you feel about that?
Well, as a Vietnamese who walked in Washington during this period of time, I would say that the South Vietnamese depend too much on the American side, you see. And that is the reason why they gave to the outside world the impression that they were the puppet of the Americans. And the Americans themselves, in many cases, they didn't try to correct this kind of image at all. Not because they had bad intention, but they have a very special attitude. I used to say that the Americans were too much impatient. And when they came to South Vietnam, they want to do everything by themselves. It is a kind of temperament on the American side. They said, let us do it quickly, and after that we give it back to the South Vietnamese. But instead of asking the Vietnamese to do things, they did it themselves. And by doing it, they created the impression around the world that the South Vietnamese were a puppet. I was not a puppet at all. When I talked to President Johnson or to McNamara or to other high official on the American side, Dean Rush, for instance, or all the people. I want an independent man. I point out to the American the kind of point of view of a Vietnamese. And just I mentioned to you before, when I saw American President Johnson after the Tet attack of '68, I mentioned to him that, well, while the other side that have the AK-47, the Vietnamese soldiers still use their own guns and I asked President Johnson to give instruction to the effect that the South Vietnamese wouldn't have the M16. And in fact, the next day when I saw Clark, he repeated to me that, well, in fact, that President Johnson did give him instruction to provide M16 for the South Vietnamese. Just a little example among all the things, you see. But in the same time, getting back to your question, it is, well, the South Vietnamese were to a certain degree victim of the international situation of that time. I used to say that if I have to talk it in terms of how, well, the real cause of the defeat of the South Vietnamese in 75, I said that number one, there is a stubborn French who refused to give back to Vietnam the independence that the Vietnamese people deserved. Second, that the kind of obsession from the communists who would like to impose on the South Vietnamese a kind of Stalinist, Leninist regime on the entire people. That is an obsession from their part, and that is the reason why they continue to wage war against South Vietnam. And the third cause, it was not cause but a kind of factor in it, the American intervention. They intervened it, but they intervened their own way. And when they, after getting tired of the war, they left their own way too. And so that is one of the three main reasons that I said were somewhat instrumental in causing the South Vietnamese. Well, I repeat it again, and I am not an anti-American at all, but I am quite a realist. When I talk to the South Vietnamese, I ask them to understand the realities and understand the American system. Politics in America is different from politics elsewhere, and they have their shortcomings. They have their tradition, good traditions of defending freedom and human dignity, of course, but in the same time they have a limitation too, and they have own way of intervening. And that is the reason why we're talking about the situation in Iraq and in Afghanistan, for example. The same problem that the US encountered in South Vietnam, they met it in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And
so when you said so, you have analyzed and you said the three reasons. I see you talking about France, you're talking about North Vietnamese, you're talking about American, and you think that what about South Vietnamese government?
of course, you see, I said to my book that the Vietnamese have to accept their own responsibility of the war. They had the wrong assumptions about the American. They thought that the American, the way they saw them after the Marshall Plan in Europe, they saw them defending the South Korean, and they thought that the American were the eternal defender of freedom and so forth. It is quite natural that the American, as a big power, have a lot of influence around the world, but in the same time, and in spite of the traditional values that the Americans kept for themselves, defending freedom, defending democracy, and defending human dignity and so forth, they have their own system and they have their own limitations, and we have to understand clearly this problem before relying completely on the American the way we did before in 1960s and in 1970s, you see. It is a hard lesson for the South Vietnamese. They have to think in terms of depending on themselves first, you see. And right now, if the Vietnamese people have to defend themselves against the Chinese, they too have to think in terms of relying on themselves. You know very well that people in Vietnam right now used to say that if we go to the Chinese, perhaps you can save the party, but we lost the country. But we go on the side of the American, and we can save the country, but we lost the party. In fact, that we have to rely on ourselves. In our history, the savior of Vietnam was fighting against the Chinese alone without anyone helping them. And so we have to rely on the people itself in promoting freedom and democracy, and only through this kind of promotions of freedom and democracy, and relying on the old people that the Vietnamese can have the resources and the ability and the willingness to defend themselves against outside interference.
Yes, sir. You spend a lot of time and also effort to serve your country as a diplomat. And many people were thinking about Vietnam War. We lost it not because of the battle, but very much, from political side. So, how do you feel? Looking back, how do you feel about the loss of country personally?
Well, looking back at into the past, I think that it was very unfortunate that the people of Vietnam had to meet unfavorable circumstances in the fight for the independence of the country. First of all, we have to remember that immediately the end of the Second World War, and after the defeat of the French by the Germans in 1940, the Vietnamese, for the first time after 100 years of domination under the French, the Vietnamese people saw some hope of getting back the independence of the country. But it was unfortunate for the Vietnamese people that the communists had the upper hand in conquering the power in Vietnam in 1945. And the Vietnamese people had to suffer from the communist regime from then on until today. And as I have mentioned in many of my books and writings, I think deep in myself that the nationalists in Vietnam were kept in a very, very difficult situation. In the 50s, they had the French to fight against the French for the independence of Vietnam. But they had no choice because the communists were in power by that time. They had no choice because they had to side with the communists for having an opportunity to fight against the French. Or they can make another choice to refuse to get along with the communists and try to have another way of fighting to get back the independence of Vietnam. They knew very well that if they continue to be with the communists, the nationalists of Vietnam would be one of these days squeezed completely by the communists, by the very, very brutal regime of the communists. And so the choice for them was to side along with the communists, to fight the French, or to stay, well, independent from the communists. The nationalists of South Vietnam by then had an opportunity later on in 49 and 50, because there was then the Bao Dai solution. They thought that perhaps it could be a way out, because that Bao Dai showed, at least on paper, the independence of Vietnam too. And so the nationalists of Vietnam sided with Bao Dai in the hopes that, well, if South Vietnam can regain independence again, it would be under another regime than the communist regime. But they discovered later on that the French had no real intention at all to help Bao Dai to gain the independence of South Vietnam. And that was the reason why, after the Geneva Conference in 1954, it was only after the Geneva Conference in 1954 that the Vietnamese in South Vietnam got in paper the independence, but in the same time the country divided into two parts, divided by the 17 parallel. Up north the 17 parallel were the communists, and down the 17 parallel was the Bao Dai regime. And the situation continued until the defeat of the French in Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And by then we had the Geneva Conference, and the French by then had reluctantly to accept the independence of Vietnam. In 1954 we had up north in 17 parallel, up north in the 17 parallel the regime of the communists, and down in the 17 parallel the Bao Dai regime. But then we began to have
Yes, can you continue about you analyzing about what happening, and it lead to your feeling and looking back the war and the loss of South Vietnam?
Well, I just mentioned to you the difficult situation in which the nationalists of Vietnam found themselves during the whole period of the war. First of all, they had to make a choice between fighting along with the communists against the French, knowing exactly that one of these days, under the communist regime, they would be squeezed out brutally by the very, very difficult regime of communism. But later on in South Vietnam, when the American came to help President Thieu after the division of the country into two parts, up in 17 parallel were the communists, and down the 17 parallel was the regime of Chief of State Bao Dai. He had been an emperor, but later on he took the title of Chief of State instead of King or Emperor of Vietnam. And the American began to interest into Vietnam only in very substantial way by the beginning of 1954 in helping the regime of President Thieu. President Thieu was appointed Prime Minister by Chief of State Bao Dai immediately after the Geneva Agreement. But in the same time, under the regime of President Thieu, in spite of the fact that all the nationalists of Vietnam had a lot of respect for President Thieu, his regime was somewhat very, very personal. Almost all the political party were excluded from the regime because President Thieu concentrated his attention on those people around him, and especially on those people from his family, especially Brother Bui Diem. The regime of President Thieu lasted for 9 years until 1963, when he was overthrown by a coup d'etat organized by the military group of South Vietnam. And the nationalists of Vietnam, when they suffer of being excluded from political activities during President Thieu regime, they thought that they had some beginning of possibility for them to participate in the political life of South Vietnam. So it was under the regime of the military people, President Thieu, Prime Minister Nguyen Cao Ky, and so forth. And the military regime, but the military regime was in name, because in spite of the fact that there were two generals at the head of the government, they organized a kind of normal election in 1967, and so General Thieu became President of the Republic of South Vietnam, and General Nguyen Cao Ky, the former Prime Minister, became Vice President, and it lasted until 1975. But when I talk about the nationalists of South Vietnam, or in general terms about the nationalists of Vietnam, I mentioned the fact that they had always in a very difficult situation. It was before between siding of the communists and fighting the French. Later on, siding with the Bau Dai solution, in spite of the fact that it was a very imperfect solution due to the obstination of the French not to give back total independence of South Vietnam. And later on, under the regime of President Thieu, it was not really what we call a dictator regime, but a very, very strong authoritarian regime, which excluded the participation of many of the nationalists of Vietnam. And until later on, they had to collaborate with the military people to survive during the whole period of the existence of South Vietnam until 1974 and 1975. It was a rather sad history for the nationalists of South Vietnam. They have to accept their responsibility in everything, in their conduct against the communists, in their conduct against the French, in their conduct against the Bau Dai solution, against their conduct against the President Thieu regime. But somehow, during the almost 30 years of the war, beginning by 1945 until the end of South Vietnam in 1975, the nationalists of Vietnam never had a real chance to fight for the independence of Vietnam, and in the same time to begin the democratization of Vietnam. And while there is a beginning of democracy, I repeated, a beginning of democracy under President Thieu regime and under the military regime later on, it was a kind of a constant fight. They had to accept it under always imperfect circumstances. Real choice for true democracy and human dignity, they didn't ever have the chance to do it until the day they were completely submerged by the communist offensive, military offensive of the communists in 1975. It is a sad story, as I have mentioned to you before, and all the Vietnamese felt it. They thought that for a time that they could count it on the American, but they had wrong assumptions about the stability of the US foreign policy. And so until the day they discovered that they could not rely anymore on the American hatred. So by the time they discovered it, it was already under the communist regime. So it is a very, very sad history, and I think that all the nationalists of Vietnam, they felt the same way I did.
So I know that you was the head of one national political party, that Viet. Can you tell me about when it was found, and then some?
It is a history of all the political parties of Vietnam by then, like the Vietnam Kuomintang, like all the parties in Vietnam. They began their fight against the French, and even before the coming of the communists. But by the time the communists came to power in 45, they lost this opportunity because the communists controlled everything. And so, it is a kind of fighting without possibility of winning everything in terms of democracy and freedom for the people of South Vietnam. The Dai Viet Party, like all the parties, were also founded in the beginning of the 40s, even before the coming of the communists by then, you see. So, myself as a young man, I knew nothing about it. I knew only, like all the young Vietnamese by then, that we had to fight for the independence of the country. But my joining of the Dai Viet Party was just a kind of circumstances through which friends or members of the families, they asked me to join the party, because the totality of the young men by then knew nothing about the Viet Minh, the communists. They knew nothing about the Dai Viet. They knew nothing about the Vietnam Kuomintang. Well, perhaps a little bit about the Vietnam Kuomintang, but most of the time they knew nothing about the Nationalist Party. They joined the Nationalist Party just by special circumstances. Whether they have friends who joined it already this party, or they have their members of the family joining this party already. So my case was not different from all the case of the young Vietnamese by then. And so the totality of the Vietnamese people in the 40s, after defeat of the French in 1940 by the German, they saw an opportunity for them, opening the horizon. So the circumstances were for fighting for the independence, and all the Vietnamese people, whether they are nationalists or not nationalists, they knew but one thing: fighting for the independence of the country. And that is the reason why some of them joining the Dai Viet, some of them joining the Vietnam, some of them the Viet Minh. It depends on the circumstances. And so later on it became a kind of country divided into two parts, on the side of the communist and on the side of the non-communist. So that is a very, very sad situation of the Vietnamese people who, through the international circumstances by then and through the happening of the circumstances in Vietnam itself after the surrender of the French, after the surrender of the Japanese, and after the intervention of the Chinese troops, they found themselves under the communist regime in North Vietnam. It was a very sad story, and myself included in it.
So what is your last wish for Vietnam?
Well, I left Vietnam in a plane of the American provided to me for flying from Saigon to Bangkok. It was hopeless by then, and when I was on the plane and then I look out of the window, the delta of Vietnam fly out and, under the windows of my little plane, and I cried by that. Just 1 hour after, with my eyes blurred by the tears, the plane landed in Bangkok. And so that is a very sad story of a man who had to leave South Vietnam under very, very difficult circumstances like that. Leaving behind my friends, leaving behind my home, leaving all the things that I cherish in South Vietnam by then. And from the day on, I never returned to Vietnam. Very sad story.
Thank you very much, sir.